This movie is the first in a series I'm going to do on specific e-learning challenges that I run into as a designer and some of the different ways that I work to solve them. So I have just a few ideas here that I'm going to show you. I just put a little storyline movie together to help demonstrate it. So the first thing I want to talk about is working with color. Some ideas that you can use for working with color. So here you can see I've got a variety of different types of buttons and objects that I can interact with, but they're all blue. They're all very close to being the same shade of blue, even though some are flat design and some of them are not. If you can get your user used to interacting with that one color throughout your project, maybe you will have buttons that they'll interact with, or instructions that will teach them how to interact, and those could all be that one color and not use that color anywhere else except for interaction. That's one way you can train your user. Whenever they see blue, they're going to remember I need to interact with that in some way. Another thing I wanted to talk about is working with bright colors. I think people just don't really think about this, but if you look at these 9 squares, now I'm a designer and I'm very creative and colors make me happy, but I can't concentrate because I'm looking at these 5 colored squares. My eye just keeps going back and forth. So use that knowledge to your advantage and only use those bright colors when they're absolutely necessary. You can see that I've used yellow here for my instructions, but it's a more muted toned down color than this bright garish yellow over here. So this yellow doesn't bother me, but if it was this shade, it would be really difficult for me to focus and even look at this slide. Another way that I use color is when you're stacking numbers, or if you have objects on your page that you want to draw attention to, specifically if it's synced with audio. So for example, if I was talking about these numbers and these are 3 different equations that came up with the same answer, but I want to draw attention to the second one, I can just put a box around it, and I find that I use orange more than any other color. A lot of corporations just don't want to use red. It sends the wrong message, and yellow is just in most cases too garish, or it just doesn't show up on a busy background. So I find that I use orange a lot. Let's move on here and talk about another idea, just in general, just a tip to get people more engaged with your content. This example right here on the left is so boring. It's just a bulleted list like you would find in any PowerPoint document. And although Storyline and Captivate and iSpring and other e-learning programs do give you the option to go in and make these transition onto the slide, it's still boring. So here's an example of how I mix this up a little bit. Same information, but I've added a line of instruction telling them what to do. So I want them to interact with my pastry selection. So here they can interact with each one of these and they can learn a little bit more about it. It's a lot more interesting than looking at a list of bulleted copy. This next tip is going to be when you're working with a lot of content. I've been doing some projects lately that are very heavy on content. You certainly don't want to have all of that on the screen at once. So here's an example of how you might use that. I have a simple pie chart graphic here, and I would certainly want to have some kind of instruction to tell them to interact with it. But I have this set up. You can see that the next button is disabled until they click on each one of these 5 areas to learn more about it. So I just have some placeholder text in here, but just to show you, I've colored the boxes so they kind of match with each one of these sections of the pie chart. But this is a way that you can go in and display a lot of content on one slide. And here I'm requiring them to at the very least click on each one of these, and I'm hoping they will have read them, and then the next button became available and then they can move on. And my last tip for this movie is talking about working with contrast. So once you start thinking about contrast, you can find that your projects will become they're much more interesting, they're much more easier for people to follow. And I also think it's important to keep in mind when you're working with visually impaired learners as well, because they may be using a program or a machine called a screen reader, and it really is going to require to be high contrast for them to be able to read the content correctly. So this bottom section shows you on the left, that one is really not high contrast enough. That's not going to be very visible depending on the person's computer, depending on their brightness settings. You're taking a chance they may not be able to interact with the content. So over here on the right, you can see that this was in this very high contrast. And all of these boxes that are all different colors here on the screen, I've used varying white and black text, but they're all very high contrast and very easy to read. So keep that in mind when you're designing your projects. Always keep contrast in mind to help with visually impaired learners, but also just to keep the flow and readability of your content going.